This is Rostra, the St. Theodore Guerin Junior Classical League podcast, where we bring the lessons of classical study into the light for the benefit of all. Welcome back to another episode of Rostra, and we're excited to have Wesley Street back with us. I think, Wesley, we were talking just before we started the show here that I think you may be the second person to do a second episode with us. So
I'm back.
That's really cool. So, yeah, glad to have you back. So what are you talking to us about today?
I'm doing Roman architecture today and how it affects the real world and the influence it had on our architecture.
That is huge, how it affected the real world and the influence, obviously. What led you to that?
Well, really, I was looking around and you see all these bridges, these arcs in our world that we have today. And
yeah.
I kind of wonder where those come from, and it turns out the Romans.
Turns out the Romans, and I think you could say that with so many things. Where did that come from? Turns out the Romans, you know?
Right.
So, yeah, all right, well, talk to us. What did you find out about this?
Well, like I just said, many buildings today are influenced by the Romans, and one big example that we all know would be the White House.
Yes.
And the White House, has those big arches and columns in the front, and back in Rome, a lot of the buildings would have those as well. And then some primary materials that the Romans would use would be stone, timber, and some marble. And we also use that today. Like a countertop, for example, could have marble or something like that. And some famous architecture that you may know is the Colosseum, the Pantheon, and the Baths of Caracalla.
All right, before we get into that, you have said a lot of stuff there, and I want to unpack each of those big pieces. First of all, you were talking about architectural styles and elements of architecture like the columns, and you specifically mentioned arches. You can go into just about any major U.S. city, even in smaller towns, and find that kind of classical architecture. You go into especially what we call the county seat, where the main government of a particular county would be, and look at their main government building, look at their courthouse, and you're going to find those columns. And part of it is there's just the idea, right, that this has lasted so long, and we want our stuff to last long, and so we're going to make it look like stuff that lasted long.
Exactly,
and so
yeah.
you kind of bringing that to bear on that. Then you mentioned arches, and you started talking about material, and there's a reason I want to bring those two things together. The Romans really arches were huge in terms of the architecture, and part of that had to do with material. Now, you mentioned, you mentioned stone, you mentioned timber, you mentioned marble. We certainly have those kinds of things. Obviously, most of the wood stuff we don't have, that hasn't survived from antiquity. But there was another material that they used that really made arches and then domes possible. Did you find out anything what that material was? We use it today. It's a very common material. But the Roman version of it, they really perfected it.
I'm not sure, but for a guess, granite?
You're getting close. It's concrete.
Concrete.
And so it had to do with volcanic ash and water and the stuff that they mixed up to make this really stable building material. And as a result, they were able to build these huge domes and arches, often without other kinds of support, because that material was able to bear that weight.
So firm, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so we have that. Now, where do we see that stuff in the ancient world? Well, you started talking about some of the classical buildings there. So go back and talk to us a little bit. What are some of those really classical buildings?
Well, the Colosseum is where everyone knows. I feel like a lot of people know what it is. You seen Lego sets and stuff like that. That's where they would have gladiator fights and showings and stuff like that. And then speaking of showings, they also designed the amphitheater, the Romans.
Okay, so let's stay on that for a minute. So obviously anybody can listen to this podcast. We are here in Indiana, and so I think about Indianapolis. We got Lucas Oil Stadium, home of the Indianapolis Colts. We've got Gamebridge Fieldhouse, home of the Indianapolis Pacers. We got these big arenas for our sports, and man, we trick them out. We've got they look good. They've got facility and used to them. Well, the Romans did the same thing, given their time period, for the gladiator shows, and there was nothing bigger or better than the Colosseum. Right? It's just gorgeous. Held 50,000 spectators. What is left of it? A lot of it is left, But if you look at it, the columns that you were talking about, you see that. Cracks me up, though, is your immediate reference. You said, yeah, we see this in Lego sets. And where that cracks me up is that Lego, a few years ago, came out with the Colosseum. In Lego, and I was like, this has to be the coolest thing ever. And if I had an extra 500
Yeah, you
bucks,
look at the price tag.
yeah, if I had an
maybe
extra
not.
500 bucks lying around, I would have gotten that thing. I've seen it. Some Lego store I was at, I think they had it actually built, and I got to look at it. I was like, oh my goodness, this is so cool. But you go, why on earth would Lego do something like that? Because it's one of those famous world buildings. You think about the Eiffel Tower in Paris, right? You think about the pyramids of Egypt. You think about the Colosseum of Rome. So important there. Then you start mentioning the amphitheater, and you're connecting it with shows. What's that all about?
So people would it's kind of like the common theater today, but for plays. So people would go to those, and they would see plays and pay money, and then it's all kind of one thing.
And very similar in architecture, too. If you go to an outside show, an outside amphitheater, you've got seats that get progressively higher as you go back, right? So people in the back can see over the people in the front. We got that architecture really both from the ancient Greeks and Romans as well there. So, I know, again, I was looking at some of your stuff earlier. I know you've got some other buildings or places that really exemplified this classic architecture. What else do you have?
Well, I also have the idea, the idea that Romans came up with was like apartment blocks, so like our apartments today.
Yeah.
I know that they used that same idea of like paying rent and living there for a short period of time like we do today in apartments.
Absolutely, which is a neat thing when people first discover that. Like any big city, you don't have a lot of space, right? So you want big sprawling houses, great. You got to go out to the country for that. But in the city, you don't have a lot of room. So what are you going to do? Well, you build up instead of building out. And so exactly what you said, you've got these apartment blocks. And I don't know if you remember this. I think we may have mentioned it last year. But the Latin word for apartment building is the same as the Latin word for island, insula. Because if you think about what an apartment building is, it's a little island of people in the middle of the city, right? So there that is. So anyhow, so you got that. What else did you find?
I found that they invented the triumphal arch, if I pronounce that
The
right.
triumphal arch, yes.
Arch, yes. And
Yes.
that's it's the arch that the road goes through, right?
It is, and I don't know. I'm an old VeggieTales song is coming up in my mind. I don't know if you ever watched the VeggieTales cartoons when you were little, but they had a song. There's a group of characters on there called the Pirates Who Don't Do Anything.
Oh, I love that. Yep, Larry's silly songs. With
Larry's silly songs, right? And so you had the Pirates Who Don't Do Anything, and a triumphal arch is basically an arch that doesn't do anything.
Right.
It's not part of
There's
a
no
building,
purpose.
right? It's not just lifting something up, but it was purely for celebration. And so you have an emperor who goes out and leads some conquering expedition. How do we honor this guy? You build this big arch in the middle of the city, and then people can gather around it and go through it and so forth. So you took that building feature and turned it into something else there. Yeah. I know I saw in your notes you had something about the Baths of Caracalla. Somewhere in there.
Yes.
What was that all about?
So that's where the Roman people would go and bathe.
Yeah. And you go, okay, well, don't you bathe at your house? Well, not necessarily so much. And when you think about bathing in the ancient world, you think about really a modern day health club.
Yeah, it's all public. They're all together and all nastiness.
And the Baths of Caracalla, though, that was a huge building. And you want to talk about an architectural masterpiece. Because it was not only a place to bathe, but it was also a place to work out, do exercise and this kind of stuff, and even had libraries part of it. So that you could actually, when you're done or before your workout or whatever, if you wanted to go and read books in Greek or Latin, you could do that. So again, you think about a modern health club or fitness club, what have you got? You got places to work out,
Pool,
maybe there's a pool, there's a
shower.
sauna, right? And you might even have a little bit of a food area where you could go and just gather and relax with friends. And so again, we're still drawing on those things, like you said at the beginning, the influence on the modern stuff there. So, okay, is there anything else you found that you want to make sure that people know if they're listening to this episode?
I think we're pretty much covered there.
So here's my question. I'm going to leave with the final question this time. If you could, assuming you could have all the modern conveniences, right? We're still going to have electricity. You're still going to have, your internet router. You got all that kind of stuff. Would you want a modern house designed like some ancient Roman building? Would you want to see that architecture in your personal home, or you're like, forget that, I want to go ultra modern? It's cool to look at, but I wouldn't want to live in it.
Let's say if I was a billionaire, I don't know if I want my entire house to look like that, but like certain sections, so I could go to this room and like, let's say I'm feeling a little Roman, I could just go into that room and have a little piece of history there.
You just came up with a great idea. I'm thinking I should build a house, and I've got my old West room.
Right.
I've got my Roman room. That would be absolutely cool. Well, Wesley, it's so good to have you back on. This is a great episode, and who knows, maybe you'll be back for a third time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Rostra. You may check out all our episodes on Spotify and follow us on social media at GarinJCL. That's at GUERINJCL.